Hi everyone, I'm here today to talk to you about some home-based balance practice. So I know we're all spending a little bit more time in our home right now and probably looking for some ways to increase our fitness. So it's a great opportunity to work on your balance. The first thing we need to talk about is balance and what are some of the different things that contribute to balance and what are some of the things that can make our balance deteriorate a little bit as we get older. The first things to think about are sensory inputs. So balance is a combination of three things. Visual input that we get through what looks like a little carpenter's level in our ear, and some information from our feet. So we call that somatosensory information. Little receptors in our feet and sometimes in our hands that help us to understand where we are in space. So if we start out with just that visual information, our balance is influenced all day long by what we're taking in visually. So think about this. If you're walking on a really bumpy, rocky trail, you're probably going to want to look down to see where your feet are in space. And that's pretty normal. But as we get older, we tend to be pretty visually oriented in our balance. So we really want to look at where our feet are more often than we would have when we were younger. You'll notice when people are very elderly and they're struggling with balance, you notice this with people, especially in crosswalks, that they tend to really look down at their feet. And you can imagine the influence that has on your posture. So think about it. If I'm looking down at my feet and my eyes are going down, then I'm going to round my shoulders and I'm going to change my posture. And I'll talk in a minute why that really matters in terms of correcting our balance. So that visual input, we have that kind of focus all the time on where things are in space, where our feet are in space, and we're always trying to get more visual input. That second part that I talked about, that little carpenter's level, is also really important. So that's the feedback that's provided to our brain about where we are in space. So that also is an important and a bit overlooked feature of our balance. And as we get older, sometimes we can have some changes in our vestibular function in that little carpenter's level. The other piece is that input in our feet. So that input in those little sensory receptors. So think about this. If I gave you the example of going into a room, and I'm going to ask you in a big wide open room to walk to the other side of the room, and it's brightly lit and there's nothing in your way, you probably wouldn't have any trouble with your balance walking across that room. But what would happen if I filled that room with pillows? You're probably going to be looking for that information through your feet, right? You might get low, you might feel around with your feet to see where the stability is. It's going to change up the inputs for your balance. Now, what would happen if I put you in that same room filled with pillows and I turned off the lights? Now you're going to want to get really low. You're going to want to feel around with your hands because those are where some of those receptors are as well to give you that feedback about your balance. So some of the other things that we can think about, there's the visual, there's the vestibular system, and there's the somatosensory system. So all of those inputs. We also want to think about flexibility. So that's our ankle flexibility and our hip flexibility. If you go onto the Age Sister website, I've written a whole blog post about this, about how flexibility can influence balance. And there's a great free download on the site as well. So you can go and get some information about stretches. The reason that it matters if we have some inflexibility in our ankles or in our hips is how we respond if we're knocked off balance. So think about this. I'll give you another example. If you were riding on a bus and you were standing and you're holding onto a pole on a bus, you're probably not going to have a lot of trouble as long as that bus is going along on a nice smooth surface. I bet at this point you're going to be standing with your feet probably hip width apart, not really having too much trouble keeping yourself upright. But think about if the bus started to go over a few bumps. Where would you start to move from? You would start to move from your ankles, right? You'd probably have a bit of a sway from your ankles, and your body's just trying to right itself back to that upright position. But we need that flexibility in our ankles to be able to have that sway. The next step, if the bus got really, really bumpy, is you're going to start bending from your hip, right? You're going to want to go low. You're going to want to try to stabilize yourself. So if you don't have good strength and flexibility through that area, that's also going to be a bit of a problem in terms of how you correct yourself. Now, what happens if the bus just slams to a stop? You're going to take a big step, right? So that requires you to have some good flexibility in your ankles and some good flexibility in your hips, and it requires you to have a little bit of strength as well. So that's the next thing to think about is leg strength, hip strength. So important overall. If you followed any of the blog posts that I write or any of the Facebook Lives, you'll know that I talk about strength training all the time. I just think it's so important. It's crucial for women over 50. And we need that strength to help right our balance throughout the day as well. So those examples that I gave you, when you have to respond, you need some good strength for that. You need to be able to correct yourself. And so if you think about strength in women over 50, think about just strength in women as they age. So even when you're going into your 20s and 30s, you're starting to have a slight reduction in the size of your muscles. And that keeps going on every decade. Your muscles get a little bit smaller, and that's what we would call a usual course of aging. It doesn't mean it has to happen, but that's what happens if we don't do anything to correct it. Once we get into our 50s and women go through menopause, then their muscles tend to get smaller much more rapidly with those changes in estrogen. So we want to do everything that we can to protect our leg strength, particularly, and our hip strength. This makes a huge difference to our healthy aging as we get older. If we have good hip and leg strength, it helps with all sorts of functional things and mobility, but it also helps with our balance. So again, we have those sensory inputs, we have flexibility, we have strength, and then we need to think about where our body is in relation to the different parts of our body. So if we